Warning. This podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household. Listen at your own risk to unauthorized and explicit reading. Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings.
Logos. From the Wikipedia. For Heraclitus, Logos provided the link between the rational discourse of people and the world's rational structure. Quote, "This Logos holds always, but humans always prove unable to ever understand it, both before hearing it and when they have first heard it. For though all things come to be in accordance with this Logos, humans are like the inexperienced when they experience such words and deeds as I set out, distinguishing each in accordance with its nature and saying how it is. But other people fail to notice what they do when awake, just as they forget what they do while asleep." Dial's Crans 22b1. "For this reason it is necessary to follow what is common. But although the Logos is common, most people live as if they had their own private understanding." Dial's Crans 22b2. "Listening not to me, but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." Dial's Crans 22b50. From the writings of Heraclitus. Also from, continuing with Wikipedia, quote, "For Aristotle," moving on to Aristotle, "For Aristotle, Logos is something more refined than the capacity to make private feelings public. It enables the human being to perform as no other animal can. It makes it possible for him to perceive and make clear to others through reasoned discourse the difference between what is advantageous and what is harmful, between what is just and what is unjust, between what is good and what is evil. Logos, pathos, and ethos can all be appropriate at different times. Arguments from reason, logical arguments, have some advantages, namely that data are ostensibly difficult to manipulate. So it is harder to argue against such an argument. and such arguments make the speaker look prepared and acknowledgeable to the audience, enhancing ethos. On the other hand, trust in the speaker built through ethos enhances the appeal of the arguments from reason. So Aristotle treats logos as a rhetorical tool of the human mind. Heraclitus treats logos as some dichotomous phenomena that is both a faculty of the human mind and an inherent structure of the universe. Pyrrhonists, Pyrrhonists, the Pyrrhonists' philosopher Sextus Empiricus, insert Sniggles by Monty Python, defined the Pyrrhonist usage of logos as, quote, when we say to every logos an equal logos is opposed, by every logos we mean, quote, every logos that has been considered by us. And we use, quote, logos not in its ordinary sense, but for that which establishes something dogmatically. That is to say, concerning the non-evident, and which establishes it in a way at all, not necessarily by means of premises and conclusion. Okay, philosopher, purists of Sextus Empiricus. We'll have to pop open. I'm so tempted to just click on hover over. Sextus Empiricus was a physician and philosopher who likely lived in Alexandria, Rome, or Athens. His philosophical work is the most complete surviving account of ancient Greek and Roman Pyrrhonism. Cool. So they were taking, obviously, the same idea and exploring it in a bunch of different ways. How interesting, how bizarre, how human of them. The Stoics portion of the Wikipedia page reads as follows. Stoic philosophy began with Zeno of Citium, 300 years before Christ, in which the logos was the active reason, and let's hover over the word reason. Reason is the capacity of consciously making sense of things, establishing and verifying facts, applying logic, and adapting or justifying practices, institutions, and beliefs based on new or existing information. It is closely associated with such characteristically human activities as philosophy, science, language. So, according to the Stoics, logos was the active reason pervading and animating the universe. Right. So not just a faculty of the human mind, not just a faculty of reality as we commonly identify it, but the very conscious reasoning or thinking procedures, not just pervading, in other words, existing throughout all of the components of, but literally animating or bringing to life the universe. Those are my interjections to the Wikipedia page. Continuing strictly from as written on Wikipedia, it was conceived as material and is usually identified with, quote, God or nature, quote unquote. The Stoics also referred to the seminal logos or logos spermatikos, or the law of generation in the universe, which was the principle of the active reason working in inanimate matter. Inanimate matter. In classical physics and general chemistry, matter is any substance that has mass and takes up space by having volume. All everyday objects that can be touched are ultimately composed of atoms, which are made up of interacting subatomic particles, and in everyday as well as, I guess we're going to have to open that bit to see what the rest of the sentence says. Matter. Where's Matt? Where'd it go? Logos spermaticos. This glossary Stoic glossary. Okay, that. Matter. Opening page. Sorry, it took me a second to find the link again. So, matter, having all everyday objects that can be touched are ultimately composed of atoms, which are made up of interacting subatomic particles. In the physical sciences, subatomic particles are the particles much smaller than atoms. The two types of subatomic particles are elementary particles, which according to current theories are not made up of other particles, and composite particles. Particles in physics and nuclear physics, studies of these, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And in everyday as well as in scientific usage, quote, matter, end quote, generally includes atoms and anything made up of them, and particles or combinations of particles that act as if they have both rest mass and volume. However, it does not include massless particles such as photons, or the energy phenomena or waves such as light or sound. What's fun, and I'm sure if I dig deep into the Wikipedia page for matter, we find it, matter and matrix, same root. And arguably, phenomenologically, logos is at the root of the matrix which manifests matter. Humans too, each possessing a portion of the divine logos. Going back to the Stoics, right? So not only did the Stoics understand logos to be the conscious process of reasoning, right? The use of logic. That's why logos stems from logic, or rather, the word logic stems from the root word logos. But that there was a logos spermaticos, or generative logos, a reasoning that engenders, produces, performs, makes alive all of matter. And that we as humans, being comprised of matter and also of conscious reasoning, we possess a portion of this divine logos, twofold, threefold perhaps. Let me get back to these triangular triads of things. The Stoics took all activity, I'm continuing from Wikipedia, the Stoics took all activity to imply logos, or a spiritual principle, as the operative principle of the world, right? In other words, all operations of the world, whatever you consider included in the world. The logos was anima mundi. Let's hover over that one. That's a link. Anima mundi, the world's soul, is, according to several systems of thought, an intrinsic connection between all living things on the planet, which relates to the world in as much as the same way as the soul is connected to the human body. Plato adhered to this idea, and it was an important component of most Neoplatonic philosophies. Oh, and here they reference Philos, right? So as the operative principle of the world, logos was the anima mundi, a concept which later influenced Philo of Alexandria, although he derived the contents of the term from Plato, not so much the Stoics. In his introduction of the 1964 edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the Anglican priest Maxwell Stanforth wrote that, quote, logos had long been one of the leading terms of Stoicism, chosen originally for the purpose of explaining how deity, lowercase d, came into relation with the universe. Isocrates' section for logos reads, public discourse of ancient Greek rhetoric has historically emphasized Aristotle's appeals to logos, pathos, and ethos, while less attention has been directed to Isocrates' teachings about philosophy and logos. and their partnership in generating an ethical and mindful polis. Let's hover over that word. Polis, plural. The poleis literally means city in Greek. Why did I decide to tackle this and slog through all that? Because I'm sure after X amount of time over parts 1 and part 2, some listeners may have started to wonder, what the bloody fuck does any of that have to do with my life? With this reality? With this insanity of, political chaos that we're living through? And I think perhaps I'm getting to that point. Isocrates, Logos, partnered with philosophy and generating an ethical and mindful city. Mind you, back in the day, there were countries. There were not countries. There were city-states. So the entire country was basically one city and its small serfdoms around it. Because, this is ancient Greece, and the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, they all lived in a really tiny, tiny little part of the world. They thought they knew the whole world, and they certainly did experience and perceive deeply profound things about the world, as expressed in their philosophia. But clearly also, they hit their limitations. So to come full circle, Philo of Alexandria in Hellenistic Judaism, Philo from 20 BC to 50 AD, in other words, a contemporary of Christ, was a Hellenized Jew. Now that's something that's been thrown around, and there's the very idea of what Jews are and what Judaism is. The thing is, there's lots of different varieties, just like there's lots of different varieties of American post-Catholic Christianity, right? Like post-monotheistic infiltration of that whole mechanism. But I digress. This is before that time. In other words, there was no such thing as the Christian church yet. Hellenistic Judaism was a form of Judaism in classical antiquity that combined Jewish religious tradition with elements of Greek culture. Until the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the early Muslim conquests of the Eastern Mediterranean, the main centers of Hellenistic Judaism were Alexandria, Egypt, and a couple of other cities. Right? I'm just reading the hover bubble. I'm not opening new pages, right? So, Philo, being born 20 years before Christ and living 50 years after his death. Well, technically that's a misnomer, right? It's Anno Domini, which translates into the year of the Lord, which does not mean after death. That's just what some people taught us in religious schools in order to kind of just sort of vaguely understand the concept. It isn't like there's 33 years in the middle and then they started counting, Before, the actual terms are not before Christ and after death. The actual terms are Anno Domini, in other words, years of our Lord, and then BC. Oh crap! I can't remember what BC meant in Latin, and that one's not clickable now. So we'll have to see what it means. We'll come back to that, right? Put a pin in it. I feel like such a putz not being able to bust. I should know this. I do know this. My brain's just wanting to talk about logos instead of before Common Era, but that's not the right one. That's the postmodern one. Before Common Era and after Common Era. That's BCE and ACE. Anyways, blah, 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 blah. Philo, a Hellenized Jew, used the term logos to mean an intermediary divine being or demiurge. Let's hover over that one. In the Platonic and Neo-Pythagorean, Middle Platonic and Neoplatonic schools of philosophy, the demiurge, or demiurgos, right, is an artisan-like figure responsible for fashioning and maintaining the physical universe. The Gnostics adopted the term demiurge, although a fashioner of demiurge is not something. And what does it mean? What does the little cogwheel do for me when I click on it? Page enable? Oh yeah, just enables or disables page preview. That's fine. We want to keep that. If you want to read about demiurge, by all means. Let us continue. Philo followed the Platonic distinction between imperfect matter and perfect form, and therefore intermediary beings were necessary to bridge the enormous gap between God and the material world. The Logos was the highest of these intermediary beings and was called by Philo the firstborn of God. Philo also wrote that the Logos, and this is a quote, the Logos of the living God is the bound of everything, holding all things together and bringing all the parts and prevents them from being dissolved and separated. So Plato's theory of forms was located within the Logos, but the Logos also acted on behalf of God in the physical world. In particular, the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, was identified with the Logos by Philo, who also said that the Logos was God's instrument in the creation of the universe. So I said we were going to come full circle, right, at the beginning. We haven't even gotten through half the pages in Karen Armstrong's book. But I wanted to touch base with and see what synchronicities we could find with what Wikipedia had to say, because presumably they can't be both being manipulated by the same all-powerful evil cabal, right? Like, I don't know, I guess they could. But my point is, in a sane world, where none of the alarmist things are as huge and as all-encompassing and absolute as the fearmongers would have you believe, then it is acceptable that reading from these pages of this book, written by Karen Armstrong, which was originally published in... Hold on, I'm trying to get to the... Missed it. Went too far. 1993. And then what's on Wikipedia today, that these two, if they agree or they share synchronicities, then they must be at least indicating things that, generally speaking, are very likely to be true. So let's return to Armstrong. On page 100 of A History of God, the very end of chapter 3, A Light to the Gentiles, she's giving us some really in-depth context into the early days of the Christian church, as, immediately inspired by the teachings and the actual workings of Jesus and his disciples, presuming that history is all accurate and that there really was a person somewhere in that time frame, give or take a decade or 10, give or take 100 years, two people, ultimately she does address this, the two people there somewhere were the people we point to with the labels Jesus, with the names, Yeshua and Christos and Magdalene and Mari and, et cetera, et cetera. Mary, as the Americans might pronounce it. So she's telling us about a leader in the early Christian church, or churches, because it was several movements, right? Not one big unified monolithic thing, not as of yet, by the name of Origen. Okay? So, Karen Armstrong, I quote, as a Platonist, in other words, someone who understood Plato, that I just referenced earlier, Origen was convinced of the kinship between God and the soul, the knowledge of the divine was natural to humanity. It could be, quote, recollected, end quote, and awakened by special disciplines. What? That's not what we get taught today, is it? No, it's not. Not so much, not in those words. Not in the words like totally natural to you, right? You're other, you're separate, you're bad. You've got to earn it through sacrifice and pain. To adapt his Platonic, I'm returning to Karen Armstrong here, to adapt his Platonic philosophy to the Semitic scriptures, because he found synchronicity, he wanted to make them make sense to the people of his time. Because remember, religions are mind models trying to describe the divine phenomena which is somewhere to be experienced. So those models must be adapted as information comes to light of those seeking to find the most eloquent way of describing it, right? This is me continuing to interject. I said I was going back and then I had a bunch of shit to say. Let's step back and reintroduce this paragraph. Here we go. As a Platonist, Origen was convinced of the kinship between God and the soul. The knowledge of the divine was natural to humanity. It could be, quote, recollected, end quote, and awakened by special disciplines. To adapt his Platonic philosophy to the Semitic scriptures, Origen developed a symbolic method of reading the Bible. Thus, the virgin birth of Christ. Now, mind you, at this point, there was a really early version of the Bible, but it wasn't the neat and tidy book that we know now. The symbolic method of reading the Bible. Thus, the virgin birth of Christ in the womb of Mary was not primarily to be understood as a literal event, but as the birth of the divine wisdom in the soul. He also adopted some of these ideas of the Gnostics. Originally, all the beings in the spiritual world had contemplated the ineffable God who had revealed himself to them in the Logos and the divine word and wisdom. All those capitals. Capital L Logos, capital W word, capital W wisdom. But they had grown tired of this perfect contemplation and fallen from the divine world into bodies, which had arrested their fall. All was not lost, however. The soul could ascend to God in a long and steady journey that would continue after death. Gradually, it would cast aside the fetter of the body and rise above gender to become pure spirit. By means of contemplation, theoria, Theoria, the soul would advance to the knowledge, gnosis, Gnosis, of God, which would transform it until, as Plato himself had taught, it would itself become divine. God was deeply mysterious, and none of our human words or concepts could adequately express him, but the soul had the capacity to know God since it shared his divine nature. This is what we get taught about the ancient Greek philosophers, but they don't tell us that they're primarily Christians, do they? They just don't talk about that. They tell us about how they interpreted geometry out of, measuring things, and how they pontificated about perhaps the smallest structures in the universe, yes, and that they designed systems that we now call philosophy. But do they explain to us in school? Not until we get into the higher order of stuff, into the higher, older levels. Not until we get to upper education, into university and whatnot, do we start to understand this. And only if we go down that path, trying to understand theologic philosophy. So, returning to Karen Armstrong's words, God was deeply mysterious, and none of our human words or concepts could adequately express him. But the soul had the capacity to know God, since it shared its divine nature. Contemplation of the capital L, Logos, was natural to us, since all spiritual beings, and here's a word for you, logikoi, L-O-G, just like in Logos, L-O-G-I-K-O-I. All spiritual beings, logikai, had originally been equal to one another. Do you understand where I'm going with this, folks? If we understood that which has been buried in this musty, boring, ridiculed, marginalized, antiquated set of ideas that our system of oppression distracts us from, if we understood that all souls are equal to one another in their direct relation to the divine source, do you think we would be putting up with the clusterfuck of bullshit that we call postmodern society? From the mundane to the outrageous, would we be put up in? Would it even be happening? That's where we get into the interesting realm of questions no one is asking, my friends. So, the contemplation of the Logos is natural to us because all spiritual beings, we, you, me, everyone on the planet is a spiritual being, were originally equal to one another. When we, no, I'm sort of paraphrasing her words, but let me get back to a direct quote. When Karen Armstrong, page 100, History of God, Light of the Gentiles, when they had fallen, only the future mind of the man Jesus Christ had been content to remain in the divine world, contemplating God's word, and our souls were equal to his. Belief in the divinity of Jesus, the man, was only a phase. It would help us on our way, but would eventually be transcended when we would see God face to face. Belief in the divinity of Jesus, the man, was only a phase. It would help us on our way, but would eventually be transcended when we would see God face to face. And where do we see God face to face? Well, if God is unfolding its divine singularity into the multiple aeons, into the multiple emanations, into the fractal unfolding, right? Top down, inside out, from the left to the right, from the right to the left, from top to bottom. If it is all those things, then where else can we see God's face but in each other and in ourselves? That's me, right? Those are my words interjecting on Karen Armstrong. Continuing with this paragraph and then moving on to the next citation. In the 9th century, the church, capital C, so now this is the more formal, the more organized religious institution. In the 9th century, the church would condemn some of Origen's ideas as heretical. What? No. How dare they? We've been being played for a very long time, friends. And Karen Armstrong has the historical references to prove it. We've been distracted ever so gently, ever so subtly, ever so insidiously, generation after generation, lifetime after lifetime, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, since Yeshua Christos spoke the truth, showed us how to experience the Logos, we've mutilated and butchered all understanding of who and what that person did and said. And it has become this bumper sticker of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy with guns and the slogan, "Kill 'em all, let God decide." And it's been happening for a very long time. And the evidence and proof of it is right there in history. And people have called it out. And yet, there we go, letting it chug along, letting it continue to pilfer and distract us and ply us with lies and, throw us into ever more complicated ideological conflict. So, let's get back to Karen Armstrong's words. In the 9th century, the church would condemn some of Origen's ideas as heretical. Neither Origen nor Clement, who's another figure in the church, believed that God had created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, which would later become Orthodox Christian doctrine. Origen's view of the divinity of Jesus and the salvation of humanity certainly did not conform to the latter official Christian teaching. He did not believe that we had been saved by the death of Christ. Origen did not, right? So Origen did not believe that we had been quote unquote saved because Jesus died on a cross. Continuing with Karen Armstrong's words, but that we ascended to God under our own steam, our own effort, the me interjecting here, our own work, our own spiritual practices that engage us with the ability that is inherent within us but has been stifled and oppressed to directly commune with Logos itself. That we ascended to God under our own steam. The point is, continuing with Karen Armstrong's words from page 100, the point is that when Origen and Clement were writing and teaching their Christian Platonism, based on, the synthesizing of Plato's work and the traditions, the oral traditions of the Christian stories, because they were not quite doctrine yet. This is what she's about to lay down on us, a real good hard mic drop. The point is that when Origen and Clement were writing and teaching their Christian Platonism, there was, italics for emphasis, no official doctrine. Nobody knew for certain if God had created the world or how a human being had been, whether or not a human being had been divine. The turbulent events of the 4th and 5th centuries would lead to a definition of orthodox belief only after an agonizing struggle. We're going to leave that bit there because we don't want to get into... I want to get to this real quick. On the following page 102, this drive for unity is fundamental to the way our minds work and must, Platonius believed, also reflect the essence of things in general. To find the underlying truth of reality, the soul must refashion itself, undergo a period of purification, catharsis with a K, and engage in contemplation of theoria, as Plato had advised. The ultimate reality was a primal unity which Platonius called the One. All things owe their existence to this potent reality. Because the One is simplicity itself. There was nothing to say about it. It had no qualities distinct from its essence that would make ordinary description possible. It just was. Consequently, the one was nameless. Quote, if we are to think positively of the one, Plotinus explained, quote, there would be more truth in silence. Citation 46 from A Light to the Gentiles, chapter 3. That's chapter 9. 46. That's in Enneads 5 and 6, or 5.6. Enneads, Enneads. This, you should see the bibliography at the back of this book, my friends. In fact, I want to do a whole episode later, which is just the bibliography of this book. It'll be a delightful read in and of itself. And skipping ahead, though, right? From page 116. The Trinity, therefore, should not be seen as a literal fact, but as a paradigm that corresponds to real facts in the hidden life of God. So that's a whole nother episode. Let's continue with the Logos, though, real quick. Let's see if we can't. It's already 40 some odd minutes. Let's see if we can keep this at least not much longer than the previous episode or part to this segment here, to this episode. Let me make sure I flipped to the right page here. Logos, HIJKL, Logos, page 01, page 128, 129. Okay. Well, let's go to 128. At the very beginning, there's a quote that I highlighted in some previous reading. Some of this is very faint. I can almost barely see where there's like yellow highlighting until I'm really reading it. But quote, as we plunge into that darkness which is beyond intellect, we shall find ourselves not simply running short of words, but actually speechless and unknowing. Citation 55 from Trinity, the Christian God. Oh yeah, we're in a new chapter. We're going to find that chapter for the footnotes, right? Where's our footnotes? Suggestions for further reading. Some amazing titles in that. We were in chapter 3, now we're several. Trinity, the Christian God. And it's page 128. And it's number 55. That doesn't make sense. 55. 55. Mystical Theology, chapter 3. Okay. Like Gregory of Nyssa, he found the story of Moses', and I don't know who she's talking about right now. She's talking about somebody's work. Let's scooch back. That's the problem. Trying to dive into a reading, you got to back up and really get some context, or else none of it makes sense. She's talking about somebody's name here. Denny's. That's hilarious. There's literally someone named Denny's in ancient spiritual religious history. Denys. In each chapter of his treatise, The Divine Names, Denny's begins, that makes me want to giggle, Denny's begins with a kerygmatic truth, a Kerygmatic truth. All right, go ahead and look that up. Insert here in post. So he begins in each of the chapters of his treatise, the divine names, Denis begins with a kierigmatic truth revealed by God. His goodness, his wisdom, paternity, and so forth. He then proceeds to show that although God has revealed something of himself in these titles, what he reveals is not himself. If we really want to understand God, we must go on to deny those attributes and names. What? He who seeks without sleeps. He who seeks within awakens, right? To reference Jung there. That's me interjecting. Continuing with Karen Armstrong's words. Thus, we must say that he is both, quote, God, end quote, and, quote, not God, end quote, quote, good, end quote, and then go on to say that he is also, quote, not good. The shock of this paradox as a process that includes both knowing and unknowing will lift us above the world of mundane ideas to the inexpressible reality itself. Are we following here? In a historical book or series of writings, this Christian by the name of Denis, isn't that weird that there's a restaurant chain named Denis? And presumably a family last name named, that carries on the name. But this dude, this philosopher Christian said that we must lift ourselves above the world of mundane ideas up into the indescribable reality of that which we call divinity itself. Thus, continuing with Karen Armstrong's words, thus we begin by saying that, quote, of him there is understanding, reason, knowledge, touch, perception, imagination, name, and many other things. But he is not understood. Nothing can be said of him. He cannot be named. He is not one of the things that are. Citation 53 for notes of chapter 5. The Divine Names, issue 5, 6, 7, chapter 3. Roman numerals always throw me for a loop. I've got to add them up. So, Karen Armstrong continues. Reading the scriptures is not a process of discovering facts about God. Therefore, should be a paradoxical discipline that turns the kerygma, Kerygma, into dogma. This method is a theurgy, a theurgy, a tapping of divine power that enables us to ascend to God himself, and as the Platonists had always taught, become ourselves divine. Why is this important? Why am I reading from this book? Because this, my friends, not because Karen Armstrong tells me so, but because my own 30 plus years of reading and investigating and witnessing the world, paying attention to the world, all of this leads me to conclude that that is precisely what politics is distracting us from. What religion, ultimately, as we know it now, distracts us from. Distracts you. Distracting everybody that's alive. From the discipline, right? An actual practice that we are supposed to be practicing, which turns through, magic. What's that other word that they often confuse for turning metal into gold? Not metallurgy, that's the actual science of working with melting metal. You know what I mean. You're probably shouting the word at me. Alchemy. There it goes. Take me a second. It is a method to stop us thinking! Exclamation point. Karen Armstrong, page 127. Trinity, the Christian God. It is a method to stop us thinking. Take a moment, let that sink in. Quote, we have to leave behind us all our conceptions of the divine. We call a halt to the activities of our minds. End quote. Citation 54 from the Divine Names, Volume 1, presumably. We even have to leave our denials of God's attributes behind. Then, and only then, shall we achieve an ecstatic union with God. When Denny's talks... I can't. When Denny's talks about ecstasy, he is not referring to a particular state of mind or an alternative form of consciousness achieved by some obscure yogic discipline. That's interesting. This is something that every Christian can manage in this paradoxical method of prayer and theoria. This will stop us talking and bring us to the place of silence. And quote, this is Karen Armstrong quoting Denny's, I presume. As we plunge into that darkness, which is beyond intellect, we shall find ourselves not simply running short of words, but actually speechless and unknowing. Reference number 55. Again, Mystical Theology, chapter 3. So we're getting close to where this the Logos bit. I forget where. I wanted to jump ahead. I believe that this is still her referencing Denny's. God also achieves an ecstasy which takes him beyond himself to the fragile realm of created being. And we must dare to affirm, for it is the truth, that the creator of the universe himself, in his beautiful and good yearning towards the universe, is transported outside himself in his providential activities towards all things that have being, and so is drawn from his transcendent throne above all things to dwell within the heart of all things through an ecstatic power that is above being and whereby yet he stays within himself. Citation 56. The Divine Names, Volume 4, Chapter 3. Emanation had become a passionate and voluntary outpouring of love rather than an automatic process. Remember they were talking about in, I think we read her discussion of emanations of the aeons in part 1. So this philosopher, this Christian philosopher, Denny's, certainly explains a lot about that restaurant, sort of. I'm just kidding. Can you imagine if, like, Saint Denny's was, like, still living in the Matrix and, like, hanging out going, like, yeah, that was me, man. He's talking about me in there. That's me. I wrote the stuff. And then I became a saint, and then I started a restaurant, homie. That'd be hilarious. Anyways, I digress. Denny's, plural, way of negation and paradox was not just something that we do, but something that happens to us. The way the world happens to us. That was me interjecting. So for Plotinus, ecstasy had been a very occasional rapture. It had been achieved by him only 2 or 3 times in his life. Denis saw ecstasy as the constant state of every Christian. This was the hidden or esoteric message of scripture and liturgy revealed in the smallest gestures. Thus, when the celebrant leaves the altar at the beginning of the Mass to walk through the congregation, sprinkling it with holy water before returning to the sanctuary, this is not just a rite of purification, though it is that too. It imitates the divine ecstasy, whereby God leaves his solitude and merges himself with his creatures. God is us. That's me interjecting. Perhaps the best way of viewing Denis plural, not plural, possessive, Denis' possessive theology, in other words, the theology of Denis, it's just that's a hard one to pronounce because it ends with an S, so then you have to have apostrophe S. And blah. Perhaps the best way of viewing the theology of Denis, that's me editing, is that spiritual dance is as that spiritual dance between what we can affirm about God, in other words, what we can say or speak or describe about God, and the appreciation that everything we can say about him can only be symbolic. As in Judaism, Denis's God has 2 aspects. One is turned toward us and manifests himself in the world. The other is the far side of God as he is in himself, which remains entirely incomprehensible. He stays within himself, quote unquote, in his eternal mystery, at the same time as he is totally immersed in creation. He is not another being additional to the world. Denis' method became normative in Greek theology. In the West, however, theologians would continue to talk and explain. Some imagined that when they said God, quote unquote, the divine reality actually coincided with the idea in their minds. Some would attribute their own thoughts and ideas to God, saying that God wanted this, forbade that, and had planned the other in a way that was dangerously idolatrous. Calling it out, folks. Calling it out plain and simple. That's me interjecting, talking about Karen Armstrong. Continuing with her words on page 129. The God of the Greek Orthodoxy, however, would remain mysterious, and the Trinity would continue to remind Eastern Christians of the provisional nature of their doctrines. Eventually, the Greeks decided that an authentic theology must meet Denis's 2 criteria. It must be silent and paradoxical. But where's the bit about logos? I guess I totally... Oh, here we go. On the following page, 130. Continuing in the middle, right? Oh, let's connect some things here. Men and women had a potential for the divine and would become fully human only if this was realized. This is on page 129. Let me back up. Greeks and Latins also developed significantly different views of the divinity of Christ. And this is hundreds of years ago, people. Hundreds of years ago, Christians were intellectually discussing and debating the nature of Jesus. Now, we're told to blind faith it and shut the fuck up and be ready to shoot anybody who doesn't agree. Do you think Jesus agrees with that? So, continuing. Greeks and Latins also developed significantly different views of the divinity of Christ. The Greek concept of the incarnation was defined by Maximus the Confessor, circa 580 to 662 AD. So Maximus the Confessor, who is known as the father of the Byzantine theology, right, lived from 580 to 662. So that's 580 years after year zero, the year that Jesus was born. This approximates more closely to the Buddhist ideal than does the Western view. Maximus believed that human beings would only mind you, take a look at his name, Maximus the Confessor. What does a confessor do? Does he confess his own sins? Does he listen to the confessions of other people's sins? Does he do both? That's me interjecting, right? Maximus, reading from Karen Armstrong, Maximus believed that human beings would only fulfill themselves when they had been united to God, just as Buddhists believed that enlightenment was humanity's proper destiny. Quote, God was thus not an optional extra or an alien external reality tacked on to the human condition. Highlighted in yellow from one of my first readings. Men and women had a potential for the divine and would become fully human only if this was realized. The Logos, capital L, had not become a man to make reparation for the sin of Adam. Indeed, the incarnation would have occurred even if Adam had not sinned. Men and women had been created in the likeness of the Logo, and they would achieve their full potential only if this likeness was perfected. On Mount Tabor, Jesus' glorified humanity showed us the deified human condition to which we could all aspire. Let me back that up. The Logos, right? This reason, procedural unfolding, this self-comprehending consciousness, this source of all pattern, this root matrix, this web of the mind of God, this original child of God, this first aeon, this original demiurge, this thing we call the Logos, had not become a man to make reparation for the sin of Adam. Indeed, the incarnation would have occurred even if Adam had not sinned. That throws a big wrench in the works for all that original sin, guilt, shame, sex shame, slut shame, negative ideological word magic that they fucking weave a lot these days about original sin. Does it not? Men and women had been created in the likeness of the Logos, and they would achieve their full potential only if this likeness was perfected. And on the mountain, Christ's glorified humanity showed us the deified human condition to which we could all aspire. The Word, capital W, was made flesh in order that, quote, the whole human being would become God, deified by the grace of God, become man, whole man, soul and body by nature, and becoming whole God, soul and body by grace. Reference 57 for Trinity. 57 Trinity. That's ambigua. Minje, page 91, 1088C. I don't know what what that kind of reference means, but ambigua, I'm fairly certain is an ancient text, right? From which this is all being referenced. Just as enlightenment and Buddhahood did not involve invasion by some supernatural reality, but were an enhancement of powers that were natural to humanity, so too the deified Christ showed us the state that we could acquire by means of God's grace. Christians could venerate Jesus the God-man in rather the same way as Buddhists had come to revere the image of the enlightened Gautama. He had been the first example of a truly glorified and fulfilled humanity. That is profound, right? And do you get that at Sunday school nowadays, my friends? Of course you don't. Now, there's a shit ton more we can go into, but I figure that's been enough for a three-parter, and it brings us to a really resounding point. What is my point? This, right there, all of that, God being you, you being God, the Logos flowing through you, is what the political, ideological cages in your minds that you cling to when you participate willingly in the cabal's system of oppression of political ideology, us versus themism, conflict, and argumentation. That is what they are distracting us from. Because if everyone understood that, if everyone lived anchored in that, if everyone flowed freely with their logos, there would be no arguing over political ideology. There would be indescribable amounts of something else going on. But yet here we are, spewing hate, defending the indefensible, ignoring hypocrisies that abound left and right and left, and letting ourselves get led onto one treadmill or another in the multiplex of treadmills that is the meat grinder merry-go-round of life and death and profiteering on everything in between. As I was talking about in a very recent episode, my friends, politics is a distraction from our true spiritual calling. And our true spiritual calling can be, in the broadest sense, put simply, to commune with Logos.